My wife and I purchased a piece of property in Foster in 1997. Our original intention was to put up a new post and beam structure. And in the course of researching post and beam, I became aware that there were people that would purchase antique buildings or antique structures and rebuild them in new locations. This intrigued me. As a child, my parents had rented or in one case owned old buildings, so I had always lived in old houses. My father was also a collector. We frequently did what he called junking. We'd go around to flea markets and junk shops and antique stores, and he collected antique toys and advertising items and just about everything at the time. So I was always interested in old things, and I wanted to learn more about this. As I learned more, it seemed like this would be a possibility. Instead of putting up a new post and beam structure, maybe we could move, relocate, or purchase an old structure. There was a house that my family had rented in the 1970s from the Jocelyn family. The house was on about 500 acres. There were several other buildings, including the Jocelyn's residence. And the house was abandoned at this time. The city of Providence had acquired all 500 acres because it abutted the reservoir, and the water supply company purchased the property or acquired the property through eminent domain. And our timing was excellent because they were just about to auction off the buildings, including the house that we had rented back in the 70s. I'd always liked the house. It had been abandoned at this time for about 12 or 15 years. The windows were broken. Some of them were boarded up. But the house is in reasonably good condition. The roof had started to leak, and there was some damage on the inside, but most everything was intact. So I contacted the person who worked for the Water Supply Board, who was in charge of the auction, and he said that this was going to be happening in about 2 weeks. And in order to qualify for the auction, I needed to secure a contractor to work with me. So the first thing I did is I contacted I believe it was the Providence Preservation Society, and asked for recommendations. And I spoke to a number of people, including Steve Tyson of Architectural Preservation Group. Most of the folks I contacted just gave me estimates that were much too high for our budget. At that time, we didn't have a lot of money, and we actually needed to kick off this project with credit cards. We weren't able to secure any kind of a loan for moving an old building. So it ended up working out that Steve Tyson was someone that we could work with. And long and behold, we got our paperwork together, talked to Steve, went out, looked at the building, got some cursory ideas of how much it was going to cost to move and put the building back up, which of course were much less than it ended up being. But we bid on the building. We actually bid. My wife and I bid, and the contractor Steve Tyson bid, and we won the bid. We won the house for $10. The purchase price of the building was $10, and we had to remove the structure, remove a house across the street that was falling down, and fill in the basement holes. We began the disassembly process in 1998. Fortunately, Steve allowed me to help him out in order to save money. So I became responsible for documenting the building and for transporting many of the smaller components from the inside. I had a 1962 Volkswagen truck at the time, and I transported probably 3/4 of the building in that truck. The first thing we did was take detailed measurements of the foundation, diagonal measurements, measurements of all the interior components. We numbered everything. We began a process of documenting each room. We assigned a letter to each room, began at one corner and worked our way around, numbering all of the molding components, the floorboards, everything that was visible. Then we took off the molding. We broke apart the plaster and lath on the interior walls. And each time we'd take a layer of fabric off the building, everything had to be renumbered, all the wallboards had to be numbered. I had to make detailed drawings, photograph everything, and in some cases I videotaped everything as well. We took the molding off, we took the plaster off, we took the doorways out, the stairways, the upstairs floor joists, the cabinets, and just about everything else on the interior of the building, until we were left with the exterior walls and the roof. We were able to actually salvage the exterior walls in essentially without taking them apart. We maintained the original plaster on the exterior walls. We left much of the exterior clapboards, the window molding, some of the interior molding, and then we sectioned them off. It's much easier to disassemble a post and beam structure than it is a stick-built structure. It's because it's assembled with pegs, it can be taken apart in most cases without any cutting or further destruction of the components. We sectioned the front of the building in 3 pieces, one to the left, one to the right, and the doorway assembly. We sectioned the gable ends in 4 pieces, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, and the back of the building in 2, one to the left and one to the right. Each one of those sections was lifted off of the foundation with a crane and laid onto a flatbed truck that we had to purchase in order to transport them. When this was completed, what we had left was the foundation, the first floor, and the fireplaces, the chimney. The chimney was disassembled from the roof. We were left with the fireboxes, which we tried to save in a couple of different pieces. We put styrofoam on the inside of them so that they wouldn't collapse, and we built wood structures around the outside and strapped them so that we could lift them off the foundation onto a truck. This was successful, but some of the fireplaces sustained damage on the way to the new location. The bricks were put together with a lime mixture, and it started to fall apart on the way to the new location, but they were essentially saved in one piece. They had to be rebuilt at the new location, however. We began the reassembly process in 1999. We began by digging the foundation hole, pouring the concrete, and then proceeding to lay out all of the components of the first and second floor, the sills and floor joists, girts and so forth. We determined what components had to be repaired or replaced, repaired and replaced those that were necessary, reassembled the structures, renumbered them, took them apart, and then reassembled them on the new foundation. This took about a month. It only took about a day to lift the wall components off of the flatbed truck and put them onto the new foundation. So within about a day, maybe 2 days, we had all of the outside walls assembled, the roof assembled, and plywood on the roof. Then what was left was the chimney, all of the interior decoration and components, the walls, and of course the restoration. Steve was responsible for reassembling the structure and repairing any of the structural elements that needed to be repaired, like the sills and floor joists. He also rebuilt the chimney assembly, including the fireboxes and the beehive oven. Probably the 2 most expensive components of putting the building back up were rebuilding the chimney and repairing the first floor structure. The restoration I handled for the most part myself. I hired a friend of mine, and I worked with relatives and friends. It took the longest. It took me about 2 years. I spent a year working on the interior of the building once it was reassembled, and I spent about a year, perhaps a summer, working on the exterior of the building. I wanted to maintain as much of the original fabric as possible. So if there was a door or a piece of molding that was damaged, instead of replacing it, most often what I did was I would disassemble it, repair or replace portions of it that were damaged, and then reassemble it. Again, with older buildings, older architecture, it's much easier to take some of these components apart. All of the doors, for instance, are pegged together. So once you take the pegs out, you can literally take every component of the door apart, repair it, and then reassemble it. The floors, although small portions of them had to be replaced or repaired near some of the windows because they had sustained water damage, for the most part they retained the original paint. So instead of stripping off the paint, I went to the paint store and tried to match the original color and just touch them up. So I left much of the original paint on the floors. And I followed that same philosophy throughout the restoration of the inside and the outside of the building. I wanted to retain, again, as much of the original fabric, including the paint, as possible. So when I stripped the interior molding and the exterior of the building, I only took off that paint which was flaking and then recoated it. So instead of stripping things down to the wood, I left all of the original paint on them as much as possible, and then just recoated it with oil-based primer, and then with a top coat of paint. And this, I think this is one philosophy of restoration. It's one that I learned in part from Steve, and one that I'm sympathetic to. A lot of people, when they restore old buildings, they'll do something like strip the entire floor down to the original wood, and when you do that, you take away some of the historical value, I think, of the fabric. You have a couple hundred years of families and individuals walking over the floor, standing in one place. There are portions of the floor that are worn more than others. There are little divots in the molding, and instead of trying to repair all those, I left them as is and only repaired what was necessary structurally and what was rotted or clearly broken, and left all of the other imperfections intact. I look at it as kind of part of the patina of the building, and think it's important to leave those things intact. Steve actually gave me a call a couple of years after the house had been completed, and said that someone had contacted him in Foster and had a barn that they wanted to remove from the property. I checked it out, and it was in fairly good condition. I negotiated a price with the owner. He and I both spent the summer disassembling it and transporting it to my property. The next year, I hired Steve to reconstruct it, to repair the sills and repair the bottoms of the posts, which were all rotted, and to put up the structure. From there, I myself and a friend and my brother put up most of the siding, the board and batten. We put a roof on it. We built 2 large front doors, put a couple of windows and a small doorway in it, and it was completed by the end of that year. I'm not an advocate of moving old buildings when they don't need to be moved. I think that the property that a building sits on is equally important to the historic value of the structure. But I think in both of these cases, the barn and the house, I feel like I was partly responsible for saving a piece of history. In both cases, the buildings would probably have been destroyed. Some of the components may have been used to shore up other buildings or to complete other buildings, but I saved them both in one piece, and a little piece of history continues.